So our guest speaker today, our guest speaker is Marlene Motyka. Did I pronounce that right?
Perfect.
Oh, very good, very good. Okay, so Marlene will be discussing renewable energy trends and the impact of COVID-19 and the Biden administration. So Marlene is the U.S. and global renewable energy leader for Deloitte and a principal at Deloitte Transactions and Business Analytics, LLP. In her role, she steers Deloitte's overall delivery of professional services ranging from tax-related issues, M&A, and financial activities, business strategy, valuation, accounting, to technology integration and operational consulting, and human capital offerings to renewable energy companies and those who invest in or utilize renewable energy. So responsible for quite a bit. And Marlene has worked in the energy and resources sector for over 25 years. She consults with clients across many industry sectors who are investing in the renewable energy and clean technology sectors. She also works with clients in the areas of valuation and financial consulting. Marlene has an MBA in finance from Rutgers University and a BS in mechanical engineer, so fellow mechanical engineer from Lehigh University. Good, nice. So with that said, I'd like to introduce Marlene Motyka to begin our presentation here.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I'm very excited to be here and kind of help you kick off your guest speaker series. So happy to be able to talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, which is renewable energy, and a lot going on in this space. And so excited to share my thoughts. Do you want to move on to the next slide, which is the agenda? And I'm definitely going to work to make sure we have enough time for kind of questions throughout and definitely questions at the end. So I'm going to start off with talking about the Biden administration and some current energy credit landscapes. I'm going to kind of kick off with some just background around what we're seeing or what we saw in the last year in terms of power and utilities and renewable sectors. We've also identified 5 trends in our 2020 outlook related to renewable energy that I'll be discussing, and then I'll have just some concluding thoughts before we can, officially move to, formal kind of Q&A at the end. So next slide. Next slide. Great. So what I thought would be helpful is to just talk about Biden's kind of day one energy priorities. And Deloitte has a very large practice that serves the federal government, and they put together, this great summary for myself and others who focus in power and utility and renewables around the Biden administration's focus on energy. And so if we kind of look at this in timeline buckets, so executive actions are things that would happen within the first 100 days. Regulation is kind of really from 100 days to 24 months. And then legislation, which is much meatier stuff, is really 6 months to 4 years. And what we understand is the Biden administration really kind of has 4 main pillars: COVID-19, economic recovery and job growth, climate change, and racial equity. And initiatives that kind of overlap into at least like 2 or 3 or more buckets are things that will, these pillars will really be a kind of a priority for the administration. And we've identified kind of equity and infrastructure and clean energy investments as kind of hitting 3 of those 4 pillars. So they don't address COVID, but they certainly address, economic recovery and job growth, climate change, and racial equity. So we see some really promising things. The renewable industry has grown a lot over the past years with, I would say, very limited support from the federal government. And now if we think about the new administration and kind of what they're looking at in terms of energy priorities, we could see some really fantastic, opportunities. So I just want to point a few things out in terms of executive actions. The first one at the bottom is re-entering the Paris Climate Agreement. That actually happened, day one. So that's already kind of a checkbox there. Also today, Biden is supposed to direct federal agencies to determine how expansive a ban will be on new oil and gas leasing on federal lands, and kind of what the scope should be for those agencies in terms of, again, considering how much federal land and waters should be preserved from mining and drilling, but then also looking at those federal lands and waters in terms of what should be set aside for renewable production, such as, floating offshore wind and also stationary offshore wind. Also, a few things related to EVs you'll see. So zero emission vehicles or electric vehicles, that's another focus on the administration that connects with the power and utility and renewable sector. When we move to the middle bucket of regulation, again, these are some items that are definitely a little bit meatier, and they also include kind of working towards the broader goal of net zero emissions by 2050 through greater enforcement mechanisms to adhere to climate goals, and that include targets related to no later than 2025. So trying to kind of set the stage for the ultimate goal in the legislative area around the goal of net zero emissions by 2050 for the United States. And the legislative buckets, actually will, I think definitely take some time. The administration has to deal with kind of integrating, we think, decarbonization and clean energy targets into broader infrastructure stimulus packages to kind of get some of these things going forward, but very progressive around funding of research and spending on clean energy initiatives and figuring out how to provide, climate solutions to communities that are most impacted. So lower socioeconomic status communities, and then again, this broader goal of net zero emissions by 2050. So a lot here, very exciting when we see some of these things and the ultimate kind of implication longer term. So next slide. I did want to point out at year end, so renewables are very much connected to tax incentives. So the investment tax credit and the production tax credit. And at year end, there was a gift to the renewable sector around extending some tax credits for the ITC and PTC. So there is an extension of the current 26% investment tax credit for solar and certain other Section 48 energy property for another 2 years, with the scheduled phase out continuing thereafter. And then also a big boost to the offshore wind sector, which I'll talk about in terms of one of the major trends, is that they now have a provision to begin construction before 2026 to be eligible for an investment tax credit, which really does help with the competitive nature of the offshore wind sector. So those are some exciting, I think, developments there in terms of, again, more certainty around, renewables and the pricing and the support for these. I think more broadly, though, the sector, does want to figure out how to potentially kind of phase out and move away from these tax credits, because they do add complications to financing of renewable projects, and they're a little bit more of an expensive form of financing than traditional project financing. So, eventually they'd like to move away from those, but this was a positive impact in terms of the overall sector. Next slide. So I have a few slides here that I'm not going to go into in huge detail, but I thought they'd just be, kind of important for you guys. So you'll get the deck afterward and you can see, and this does talk about the investment tax credit for solar qualified fuel cells and gives you the timeline for that, because this will impact, kind of the construction and the development of renewable projects. Next slide. Here it talks about, again, qualified small wind turbines, combined heat power, geothermal heat pump, geothermal overall. Next slide. And the last one was waste heat recovery and qualified, offshore wind. So again, just put those in there for your own, information. Any questions before I move on to the next section about any of the items I've touched on so far?
Yeah, I have a quick question. Can you explain what is fiber optic solar? I saw that as one of the types of energy.
That's a good question. To be honest, I don't know the official definition. So I'll have to get to you. Some of these things are in here are a little bit unusual and obscure. And, sometimes they're really trying to support some very new type of technologies. But I will, to be honest, I'll get back to you because I don't have the official definition of that.
Okay.
Which tells you it's not really very much in use.
All right.
Okay, next slide. Oh, here's just another slide around production tax credit and investment tax credit. In some cases, you could use either or. So next slide. I think we'll go on from there. Okay, next slide again. So what I want to do is just set the stage overall in terms of thinking about power and utilities, and then moving into renewables. So what's very important is that the power and utility industry really is starting to lead what we would call a clean energy transition. And I think why is that happening? There is a lot of pressure from stakeholders, and that includes, citizens to shareholders, around looking at emissions and what you're doing from a environmental perspective. So utilities are getting a lot of pressure, in terms of focusing on, what they're using for their generation means. And so, it's not only utilities, but it's their host cities, it's states, and customers who really are announcing plans to fully decarbonize over the next 3 decades. And this is even despite the pandemic we've been through, and the fact that, there was a little bit of a shock to the electricity load. And we did a post-election survey of power and utility executives. And the response that we got from them is that 33% of them said utilities should primarily focus on decarbonization strategy, and 29% said they should focus on a digital strategy over the next year. And what was interesting is that renewables recorded record high penetration this last year. And, I think it really helped, COVID really did help, the urgency in terms of the energy transition and what should be done in terms of, moving to clean energy. And so where do we go from here? I think that in 2021, as I mentioned, the big change is that we no longer expect to see the federal policy headwinds that we had, under the last administration, in terms of moving to a clean energy transition. And really policy on the other side is really going to be on the other end of the spectrum, and really going to be pushing and supporting the accelerated, energy transition. And I think we're going to see a broader industry the broader energy industry starting to converge in the coming year. And I think we're going to see kind of players kind of moving into different areas. So I think what we could see is that, like, we'll see electric transportation and the building sector who are going to witness, companies with varying levels of, regulatory, technology, and capital constraints coming together and trying to partner with power and utility companies. So how can they work together to meet decarbonization goals? I think another thing we're going to see is oil majors diversification of their strategy. They've already been looking at their strategies and much more getting into electric vehicle infrastructure, energy storage, the renewable generation. And we think this is going to continue moving forward, and they're going to continue to make investments across the power sector's value chain. And then automakers are probably going to have an increased shift towards EVs. And this could also help enhance the electric grid because we'll have more charging infrastructure and battery storage equipment. And so, there'll be a need for those automakers, the EV infrastructure, and the power and utility companies to work together. And then technology companies, may continue to get involved in this sector by looking to enable vehicles, homes, and businesses, to be served by distributed energy resources. So a lot of interesting things happening in that side. Next slide. So now if we kind of go down a layer and look at renewable energy. So despite the pandemic and the recession, states, cities, and utilities did pursue decarbonization. And what's interesting to note is that while the US electricity consumption fell around 3.6% in 2020, the share of renewables exceeded that of coal generation for 153 days versus 39 days in 2019. So renewables were coming to the forefront in terms of generation because they were more economic to generate versus and use that power versus coal-fired generation. And renewable growth, I think, is going to significantly accelerate above current projections under the new administration, because as I mentioned, we're going to be joining the Paris Accord. Biden had originally proposed he would invest $2 trillion in clean energy, and then also, again, looking to decarbonize the power sector by 2035. So some really interesting opportunities there. And I think the support of federal action could accelerate the commercialization of new technologies, so including advanced batteries and other forms of storage, offshore wind, and green hydrogen technology. So let's move to the next slide. But any questions on that kind of introduction before I move to the 5 trends? Okay. Then let's get to the 5 trends. So what we were doing is looking at, kind of what we see are the trends to look out for in the renewable energy sector. And, the first one is we see some consolidation expected across the sector. We do see new economies, and there's 2 listed here, but I'm going to talk about the hydrogen economy and how that will help clean energy infrastructure. Battery business models. So I'm going to talk specifically about business models that are emerging both at the utility and residential scale. I'm going to talk about offshore wind and the new entrants we see there and the possibilities for growth. And then I'm going to look at fortifying against disaster readiness and looking at how we think the sector is going to look at supply chain strategies and looking to actually onshoring some of that supply chain to prevent some disruptions in the supply chain. So let's get into the first trend. So deal making is really likely to increase in 2021. I mean, this is because, companies and utility and governments are striving to meet, ambitious climate goals. And we also do see SPACs, which are special purpose acquisition companies, who are entering the clean energy space. So they're looking to invest in growth companies and take them public and make a lot of money there. And then also because of the federal support. So all of that we think is really going to create interest in the clean energy sector and the renewable sector. Also, the rising competitiveness of renewables, sustainability imperatives and challenges to pipeline projects could lead utilities to kind of double down on less risky investments in renewables. So some electric companies are bypassing plans to invest in natural gas as a bridge fuel, which is kind of a big thing. And then also I think one particular thing to note was in 2020 is that Dominion Energy and Duke Energy canceled their joint Atlantic Coast pipeline project due to high costs and also legal challenges. And Dominion actually sold its gas transmission and storage business so it could focus on state regulated and a sustainable focused utility, because they've pledged also to fully decarbonize. And, we think renewable assets are actually attractive to investors. So, they have steady, cash flows, they have a long life. And so they provide for asset diversification. And, it's kind of a positive from that perspective. And then distributed energy resource consolidation opportunities are also, kind of strong out there. We saw Sunrun acquire Vivint. And this was kind of helping consolidate the residential solar market. And they were looking for opportunities to kind of operationalize and kind of and also get some financing cost benefits and get some efficiencies from complementary businesses. And then we did also see backup generator provider Generac acquire Nabla Power Networks, because they wanted to get access to behind the meter solar plus storage fleet and its virtual power plant and DER management platform so it could work on grid resiliency. So some interesting things happening on that side. Let's go to trend 2. So new economies. So this is interesting here. We are, as a firm, hearing a lot about hydrogen now. A couple years ago, I actually had the privilege of going to Australia and speaking about renewable energy at the Australian Petroleum annual conference, and they were talking about hydrogen there. And there wasn't really much conversation happening in the US, and it's really kind of picked up in the last year. So, and this is because, as decarbonization proceeds, I think many industry stakeholders are considering hydrogen production and storage projects to further cut their carbon emissions by expanding clean energy infrastructure. And many electric and gas utilities have announced plans to ramp up renewable hydrogen production in 2021. So, hydrogen can expand clean energy infrastructure in 3 ways, as I show here. So first is that renewables can actually power the electrolysis to produce green hydrogen. An example of this is NextEra started piloting a $65 million project to produce hydrogen from solar energy to replace a portion of the natural gas needed to fuel a power plant slated to come online in 2023. Second, a renewable penetration, as renewables continue to increase penetration on the grid, green hydrogen can provide a seasonal storage to maximize curtailment and actually provide grid balancing. So right now, the US doesn't really have any cost competitive long-term energy storage opportunities. We're looking at lithium ion, which is 4-hour, but we don't have a longer duration battery storage opportunity or source, or it's not battery, energy source that is also cost competitive. And so San Diego Gas and Electric is planning to place 2 long-duration green hydrogen storage projects into service by 2022. Third, blending of green hydrogen with natural gas can help utilities decarbonize their gas infrastructure. So, when they're looking at their generation fleet, they can switch from fossil generation to renewable generation, but they have their gas distribution systems. And so National Grid, Con Ed, Orange and Rockland utilities have started researching the potential for hydrogen blending in their natural gas systems. And that's not only happening here, this is happening globally. And in 2021, the Biden administration may help accelerate the timeline for green hydrogen to reach cost competitiveness through its plans to invest in electrolyzer technologies. I mean, so the good thing is that this is being looked at globally, and the ability to potentially get to economies of scale and reach cost competitiveness could happen, by tapping into success and that's happening more globally. Why don't we move to the next slide? So battery business model. So I just talked a little bit about, batteries, and, energy storage is really becoming one of the fastest growing asset classes in the energy industry. And this is because there's falling costs and there's maturing technology that are making use cases more economical. And this is from kind of even grid ancillary services to on-demand power. So we have an annual renewable energy seminar. I remember 4 years ago, we had a panel around emerging technologies, and we were talking about batteries, kind of lithium ion batteries as still being emerging. And so that's really changed, over time. Certainly there has to be more focus again on different types of storage technology outside of lithium ion, which is, predominantly used. But what we are seeing is solar plus storage cost synergies and operational efficiencies are taking place. And so they're boosting co-locations and supersized batteries. Example of this is the Gemini solar project in Nevada. That includes a 380 megawatts of storage, which is huge. And we expect to see that trend continuing. There's also a lot going on in terms of wind repowering. So looking at older, kind of wind farms that have, much smaller, turbine sizes. And the fact is, if you replace the turbines and the nacelle and some of the other equipment, you have the ability to actually generate more electricity on that site and also take advantage of the existing tax credits. So we see a lot of that happening, and there is more conversation and discussion around adding batteries to those wind projects. And, again, taking advantage of the tax credit for that storage combined with the wind. And then, there are drivers for utility storage deployment, and that includes, capacity shortfalls that utilities have, but also state storage mandates. So utilities are looking to include storage as a capacity resource in their integrated resource plans. So, that's really a new kind of evolution, continuing to look at, what other new technologies can they leverage in their integrated resource plan, in addition to energy efficiency, demand response, traditional, fossil generation, and increasingly renewable generation. And then state mandates. There are many more state mandates that are popping up related to storage. So 30 states now have renewable portfolio standards that require some portion of the electricity in that state to come from renewable sources. And some specifically call out solar or wind, others are more general, but states are now increasingly including storage mandates. New York, New Jersey, Arizona, in addition to Oregon, California. So we expect this to also be a trend going forward. And then resilience concerns. And revenue opportunities will also be key drivers for utility and a residential solar plus storage. I mean, revenue opportunities are continuing to grow for storage. But it does really depend upon, the region of the US and the ability for that, market to compensate storage for the value that it adds to the grid. There's been some activity in FERC around identifying the fact that, regional transmission organizations need to provide an opportunity for storage to be compensated for the service it provides. Still a lot to do there in terms of rolling out, the actual market opportunities and actually implementing those pricing structures and signals in the markets. But that's a very positive thing. And the FERC also was doing the same thing with other distributed energy resources. The FERC is interesting. Now we have a new head of the FERC. Biden put someone else in charge of FERC, and there's the ability to kind of put some more folks on the FERC. And we expect that the FERC now will be more active in supporting, renewable sources and other forms of distributed energy. Any questions on the 3 trends I've covered so far? Or anything I haven't covered that you'd like to just ask me?
I have a question regarding redox batteries for long-term storage between seasons.
Yeah.
Is there anything being developed on that? I was a bit surprised with the hydrogen option, since hydrogen tends to leak out on long-term storage and requires cryo cooling.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're constantly looking at other kind of, options. I would just say I'm not sure that anything has truly been utilized yet on large scale. I know it's a big focus for the labs. I know it's a focus for organizations like EEI trying to work with utilities, but I'm not aware of anything that's really been truly implemented and utilized yet. I would say that I think we're going to have multiple solutions in that space, and I think we should have multiple solutions. So I think that people naturally have gravitated to lithium ion at this point, but there's, flywheel technology. There's other types of technologies that I think could also be coming, forward in more prominence.
Great.
All right, any other questions? Okay. Then why don't we move to trend number 4. So this is one in terms of scaling up. This is a topic that I am very interested in. It is wind going offshore. So the offshore wind industry, I think really, we've been hearing a lot about it for a long period of time. And I'll have to say, we write these outlooks. We've been writing them for a number of years. I've been talking about offshore wind for a number of years, saying it's about to take off. Well, I really think we're at the point that it is really going to take off, and it'll prove me right. So I think the sector did demonstrate some resiliency in 2020. There was actually the construction of the first turbines ever installed on U.S. federal waters. That was for a Dominion project. And so it happened, kind of on schedule despite the pandemic. And I think the wind industry's frontiers are expected to really increasingly move offshore, as the new administration is looking to help streamline the approval process across the local, state, and federal levels. That's really been a challenge. And the BOEM is, looking to figure out how to streamline that process. Offshore wind holds great decarbonization promise thanks to its high capacity factors. I mean, turbines now one single turbine now is 12 megawatts. There's a 14 megawatt single turbine coming forward. So huge capacity factors and huge deployment potential. And in 2021, I think the industry is, going to continue to look to boost efficiencies with these larger turbines, taller towers, and longer cables. There is a ton of offshore wind already in place in Europe, and it's also starting to evolve and grow in Asia. And so, again, the US being a little bit behind the 8 ball here can kind of leverage and take advantage of what's happening more globally. And what's interesting is we see now many joint ventures happening in the offshore wind market. So you have a European company who's developed offshore wind, in Europe, coming to the US and teaming up with a US entity or US utility who understands the regulatory market. And the two of them are bringing their knowledge and skill set together and the ability to fund and finance these massive projects. And what we have is that also many East Coast states, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, are proceeding with plans to develop domestic supply chain infrastructure to help, manufacture and transport these increasingly large turbines and towers. And so it's really the US is looking to develop this entire, ecosystem to meet the growth of this area. And then, floating offshore wind is also becoming increasingly competitive. And this could, unlock some greater frontiers for offshore wind. The technology's levelized cost of energy, has halved since its first pilot project, and it is on the cusp of, kind of getting some non-recourse financing, which could further lower costs. So that's an exciting time, and that could really open up some greater opportunities in other parts of the US. And then major oil and gas companies are shifting their focus towards both fixed and floating offshore wind. I would say primarily the fixed offshore wind, because they see it as a new, consistent, and low carbon revenue source for them in an area where they can actually take their expertise in offshore environments. And an example is in September, BP took a 50% stake in Equinor's Wind Empire project in New York and Beacon Wind in Massachusetts. So you had two, oil and gas companies teaming up. And then 2 weeks ago, the state of New York actually awarded power purchase agreement contracts for these projects, which total about 2.5 gigawatts. And these awards are going to help New York move closer to its goal of 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035. So there are still some challenges, and I think federal support could really help evolve and push along offshore wind and really help it play a greater role in decarbonization. So, certainly one thing is the fact of permitting. So streamlining the permitting process across local, state, and federal levels to accelerate progress on actually the 15 active commercial wind energy leases currently in the pipeline would be huge. So, preventing delays there won't jeopardize power purchase agreements in place and really help them monetize those tax credits that are out there. Also, transmission, coordinated offshore transmission development between state grid operators and project developers could really help enable cost sharing and open access and efficient deployment. So that the federal government kind of weighing in on that would be helpful. And then, another thing is FERC, as I mentioned, the appointment of the new FERC regulatory commission head could usher in greater FERC role in facilitating, kind of offshore wind transmission planning and, promoting some other things more generally in renewables. And then BOEM, so in additional funding to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, could accelerate the timeline of holding lease auctions for subbed rights in California, Hawaii, Maine, New York, North Carolina, and South Carolina, and so open greater markets there. Any questions before I head to trend 5? Okay, so trend 5. So what is always big is thinking about, disaster readiness. And, when we think about this last year, we think stakeholders are going to prioritize supply chain reviews in 2021 as the renewable energy looks to greater post-pandemic resilience, because they really need to diversify supply chain outside of China and really kind of maybe look more towards onshoring manufacturing in the US. And so, that there's a recent tariff increase from 15 to 18% related to some renewable technologies on the solar side for solar panels, and also the elimination of an exemption for bifacial solar panels could really also drive some additional onshoring. Stronger policy measures are expected in 2021 to safeguard against technology and data from cyber attacks, and reduce U.S. dependence on other countries for strategic materials. So, we think there are kind of 2 trends that are going to really kind of push this aspect of supply chain and accelerate things in 2021. So the first is the diversification of supply to build resilience. So Biden proposed a 10% Made in America tax credit. I know there was an announcement yesterday, and I apologize because I didn't see what that announcement is, but I know he is focused on, Made in America and trying to boost domestic manufacturing. And also the new administration could launch a comprehensive supply chain reviews and use the Defense Production Act to build capacity and really work with allies to shore up critical supply chains in the US. Second is increasing use of digital technologies kind of at both ends of the developer supply chain. So looking at robotics and automation and analytical solutions, such as asset tracking and predictive maintenance, to really help track supply chain disruptions, understand at-risk supplies, and assist with warehousing decisions to really optimize supply chains. And then also residential solar developers are increasingly using remote interactions, using like digital permitting to help, size out and reach the residential solar market. Companies like Sunrun and SunPower used to do a lot that was door-to-door and in person, and they've had to completely shift to remote. And that's happened in this last year. And they've had the opportunity to kind of actually find efficiencies in their process, but we expect that to continue, and more ways for renewables to look at how to implement digital solutions. Any questions on supply chain and fortifying disaster readiness? Okay. So next slide is really just kind of a concluding thought here. Next slide, sorry. We have these sub-pages here. So renewable energy, I think, really is expected to experience significant growth in 2021. The Biden administration has goals of achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And so this is one piece of the Biden administration, looking to support renewable energy and clean energy, but there are, many more facets and aspects to his support of clean energy and clean technology. I think we'll continue to see new technologies in terms of, kind of commercialization, green hydrogen production, new storage technologies, moving towards commercialization, to really help with the greater support of renewables on the grid. We continue to expect to see kind of multiple players in the power industry sector. Companies used to be in their swim lanes before, right? You had oil and gas companies just did oil and gas, and you had power and utilities, and then you kind of had, you had renewables starting to emerge, and now you've got oil and gas companies increasingly coming into the power and utility and renewable space. You've got technology companies coming in, and some of that knowledge and expertise is really helping evolve the industry overall. And again, we don't see that backing down in any way as we think about this energy transition and this move to decarbonization. Battery storage business models, I think, are going to continue to evolve. And some of these points are things we covered in our power and utility outlook as well. And I have a link to that when we get to the end here. But, battery storage business models are starting to change as well. And they need to be part of the mix and part of the solution as we look to add more renewables and their intermittent generation onto the grid. And then fixed and floating offshore wind sector pipeline is really very strong, and we expect it to grow. And many states are looking at that as part of an economic development platform as well. If they develop these supply chains and these ports, they'll be able to deploy more people in that space. And then again, the industry, power and utility sector is always targeted in terms of cyber attacks. And the industry is expected to really continue to focus on cyber attacks, but also address supply chain disruptions and think around where equipment is coming from and how we can actually be more resilient in terms of supply chain. So those are my remarks. Any questions? Written or verbal?
Nothing written,
Okay.
Nothing in the chat.
Yep.
Does anyone have any questions?
Well, Marquise has the deck. He'll send a PDF around. If you move forward, Marquise, you can see that I've got, keep going, one more. There's my contact information. You're welcome. One more page, I think. So the content here I talked about was from our 2021 renewable energy outlook. We also have a power and utility industry outlook. The trends I talked about in the renewable space are trends that we saw also on a higher level in the power and utility sector, and from a little bit of a different lens and a different perspective. So you may want to kind of read both of the outlooks for some more detail, but happy to kind of answer questions going forward. You have my contact information. We issue publications quite frequently. We had one around the decarbonization of the utility sector. So those might be of interest to you. We cover oil and gas. We cover industrial sectors, all different types of sectors. And so feel free to go root around at Deloitte.com and see if there's anything of interest. We also have our own webinars that provide CPE credit, and you can sign up for those as well.
That's good.
Great. So hopefully you guys found this helpful. I appreciated the opportunity to share with you some of our perspective and thoughts.
Yeah, no, it was very, very informative. I appreciated it. You did cover a lot of information. Does anyone else have any questions? Because she did kind of bombarded us with a lot of information. So you have to kind of take it in and then think.
Yeah, no, and that's fine. That's fine. And again, if people have questions outside of what I covered, I'm happy to try to also answer them.
Yes, but I do have I'll send out the slide deck to everyone who attended the presentation.
Okay. Excellent.
Okay.
Well, again, I appreciate the opportunity and hope everybody has a good